Stop for a moment and listen carefully, because there is a moment when someone who kept pulling away suddenly feels the weight of your absence. Not because you begged them to stay, not because you chased them, not because you finally found the perfect words. It happens when you stop waiting. And in that moment, something changes. The person who once felt comfortable knowing you would always be there begins to understand that your presence was never guaranteed. Your patience had a limit. Your love had boundaries. And your heart, although generous, was never meant to be a place where someone could disappear and return whenever they wanted. There is a powerful principle in life. What you continually make available without boundaries eventually becomes something people stop appreciating. Think about that. When someone knows you'll always answer, always forgive, always explain, always reach out, always give another chance, they can become comfortable with your availability without developing gratitude for your presence. But when you step back, not to manipulate them, not to punish them, but because you finally choose peace over emotional chaos, the entire equation changes. Suddenly, they have to experience what you experienced: the quiet, the unanswered questions, the empty space. The realization that the person who once made themselves emotionally available is no longer standing at the door waiting to be invited inside. And that's when the mind begins to replay memories. They remember the conversations they dismissed. They remember the moments you showed up. They remember the patience they didn't understand. They remember how deeply you cared. They remember the safety they had around you. And perhaps most importantly, they begin to recognize something they couldn't see while you were there. You were not asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person to give what they had not yet learned how to give. That's a painful distinction, because sometimes we spend months, even years, trying to convince someone to recognize our value. But your value was never created by their recognition. Ride that again in your heart. Your value was never created by their recognition. You were valuable before they met you. You were valuable when they misunderstood you. You were valuable when they walked away. And you will remain valuable whether they return or never knock on your door again. There is divine wisdom in this. Sometimes life removes a person not because you weren't worthy of keeping them, but because keeping them would require you to keep abandoning yourself. And that's the part nobody wants to hear. You can love somebody deeply and still decide that the relationship is no longer healthy for you. You can understand their wounds without volunteering to become wounded by them. You can have compassion for their fear of intimacy without making their fear your permanent home. You can forgive someone without giving them unlimited access to you. That's maturity, that's strength, that's self-respect. And when you finally understand this, you stop asking, how do I make them miss me? You start asking a much more powerful question: why was I willing to lose myself just to keep someone else? That question can change your life, because chasing someone who withdraws teaches you to measure your worth by their attention. But choosing yourself teaches you to measure your life by your values. And your values must become stronger than your emotional impulses. You have to learn to say, I can miss you and still move forward. I can love you and still have boundaries. I can wish you well and still close the door. I can remember the beautiful moments without returning to the painful pattern. That is freedom. And here's something else you need to understand. When an avoidant realizes they lost you, they may reach out. They may suddenly become curious. They may send a message. They may check your social media. They may ask mutual friends about you. They may suddenly remember how much they cared. They may even tell you that they miss you. But don't confuse missing you with being ready for you. Those are two completely different things. Missing someone is an emotion. Building a healthy relationship requires character, consistency, communication, accountability, courage, and emotional responsibility. Anybody can miss you. The real question is, can they meet you where you now stand? Because you cannot build a future with someone's potential. You build it with their patterns. You cannot build intimacy on promises alone. You build it through repeated actions. You cannot create emotional safety with someone who continually makes you question where you stand. And this is where your transformation becomes powerful. You stop looking for signs. You start looking for consistency. You stop analyzing every message. You start observing behavior. You stop asking, do they still love me? You start asking, does this relationship allow me to love myself? That is a completely different level of consciousness. And perhaps the most surprising thing will happen when you truly detach. You may discover that you don't need them to come back anymore. At first, you thought your healing would be complete when they finally realize what they lost. But eventually, you realize something far greater. Your healing is complete when their realization is no longer required. That's the breakthrough, because the ultimate victory isn't watching them regret losing you. The ultimate victory is becoming so rooted in your own identity that their regret no longer determines your worth. You don't need revenge. You don't need to prove that you were right. You don't need to make them jealous. You don't need to become cold. You simply need to become unavailable for what destroys your peace. There is a divine principle that applies to every area of life. What you tolerate repeatedly, you teach people to repeat. So if you continually accept inconsistency, inconsistency becomes the relationship. If you continually accept emotional distance becomes normal. If you continually accept being an option, eventually you forget that you deserve to be a priority, but the moment you establish a boundary, you send a message, not only to them, but to yourself. My heart matters. And when you honor yourself consistently, your entire life begins to change. Your standards change, your relationships change, your energy changes, your confidence changes, your future changes. Because you finally understand that love isn't supposed to require you to disappear. Real love doesn't demand that you betray your own needs just to preserve someone else's comfort. Real love has courage. Real love communicates. Real love takes responsibility. Real love doesn't run every time intimacy becomes uncomfortable. And if someone is not capable of giving that today, you don't have to hate them. You simply have to stop building your life around the hope that they will become someone different tomorrow. Let them have their journey. Let them face themselves. Let them learn whatever life needs to teach them. And you have your own assignment. Build yourself, heal yourself, strengthen yourself, feed your purpose. Become the person you were supposed to become before you ever met them. Because sometimes the greatest gift a relationship gives you isn't the person, it's the awakening. It shows you where you were settling. It reveals where you were afraid to be alone. It exposes the places where you confused persistence with love. And then life gives you a choice. You can go back to the old pattern, or you can become someone who no longer needs that pattern. So if they eventually realize they lost you, let them realize it. But don't make that your mission. Your mission is bigger. Your mission is to become so deeply connected to your purpose, your values, your faith, and your own identity that you no longer chase what requires you to abandon yourself. Maybe they'll come back, maybe they won't. But either way, you win when you refuse to lose yourself again. Because the most powerful moment isn't the moment they realize they lost you. It's the moment you realize you found yourself. And when you find yourself, you stop begging people to recognize your worth. You stop negotiating your dignity. You stop confusing distance with mystery and inconsistency with love. You become peaceful. You become intentional. You become selective. And you understand that the right people don't need to be chased into recognizing your value. They recognize it through how they treat you. So stand up, not physically internally. Stand up for the person inside you who spent too long waiting. Stand up for the heart that kept giving. Stand up for the future that deserves your full attention and say, I will not abandon myself to be chosen by someone else. Say it again. I will not abandon myself to be chosen by someone else. That is not bitterness. That is not ego. That is self-respect. And when you live from that place, you don't become less loving. You become more powerful. Because now your love comes from abundance instead of fear. You give because you choose to give, not because you're terrified someone will leave. You stay because the relationship is healthy, not because you're afraid of being alone. And you walk away when necessary, Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring about yourself too. That is the transformation. That's the lesson. And that may be the moment they realize they lost you. But more importantly, that's the moment you realize you were never meant to lose yourself in the first place. There comes a moment when silence stops feeling temporary and starts feeling real. For someone who has become accustomed to your presence, your attention, your patience, and your willingness to keep the connection alive, that moment can be deeply confronting. As long as you were reaching out, checking in, explaining yourself, forgiving, waiting, and leaving the door open, there was a certain psychological comfort in knowing that you were still there. Even when they pulled away, some part of them could assume that you would eventually return. But then something changes. You stop. Not because you want to manipulate them. Not because you're trying to create jealousy. Not because you're playing some emotional game. You stop because something inside you finally says, I cannot keep giving from an empty place. And that is when your absence becomes real. There is a powerful principle in human behavior. We often don't recognize the full value of something while we have continuous access to it. Familiarity can create blindness. When someone knows they can reach you whenever they want, they may stop consciously appreciating what your presence actually provides. Your message becomes ordinary, your support becomes expected, your patience becomes assumed, your forgiveness becomes predictable, and your love becomes something they unconsciously believe will always be available. But when you withdraw your availability, they suddenly have to experience the space your presence used to fill. They may reach for their phone and hesitate. They may think about sending a message and wonder whether you'll respond the way you used to. They may revisit old conversations. They may notice that you are no longer checking on them. They may wonder why you aren't asking what happened. They may begin asking themselves questions they avoided when you were still standing in front of them. Did I push too far? Did I take them for granted? Why aren't they coming back this time? What changed? And sometimes the most powerful answer is not a message. It's your absence, because silence can communicate what endless explanations could never communicate. When you repeatedly explain your pain to someone who isn't ready to listen, your words can become part of the background. But when you stop explaining and begin living differently, the change becomes impossible to ignore. You aren't trying to make them feel your absence. You're simply no longer protecting them from the consequences of your absence. There is a difference. If someone repeatedly withdraws, you don't have to chase them into emotional safety. If they repeatedly create distance, you don't have to spend your life proving that you are worth staying close to. If they continually make you uncertain about your place in their life, you have the right to step back and protect your peace. And here's where the deeper lesson begins. Your absence is not powerful because it makes another person suffer. Your absence is powerful because it reveals what happens when you stop abandoning yourself. For a long time, you may have thought your responsibility was to preserve the connection at any cost. You thought if you were more patient, more understanding, more loving, or more forgiving, eventually the other person would feel safe enough to stay. But love cannot be sustained by one person's effort. A relationship requires participation. It requires two people willing to communicate, grow, repair, and take responsibility. And when you finally stop carrying the entire emotional weight of the connection, reality becomes visible. You discover whether there was mutual effort or merely your persistence. You discover whether there was genuine commitment or simply comfort. You discover whether they valued you or simply valued knowing that you were always available. That realization can hurt, but sometimes truth hurts because it is freeing you from an illusion. Your silence is not a weapon. Your distance is not revenge. Your boundary is not cruelty. It is simply the moment you decide that your peace deserves a place in your life too. And when that happens, something inside you begins to change. You stop asking, how can I make them come back? You begin asking, what kind of relationship do I want to come back to? You stop measuring your worth by their response. You start measuring your choices by your values. You stop waiting for someone else to validate your importance. You begin validating yourself through the way you live. And that is often when the other person finally understands something they could not understand while you were constantly available. Your presence was a gift. It was never an obligation. There is a profound difference between losing a person and losing access to a person. Sometimes an avoidant doesn't immediately understand the emotional value of someone because the relationship has allowed them to maintain distance while still knowing that the other person remains available. They may have become accustomed to your messages, your patience, your affection, your forgiveness, and your willingness to keep the connection alive. So when you finally step back, the first thing they may feel isn't necessarily heartbreak. It may be the disruption of familiarity. Suddenly, the emotional safety net they never consciously acknowledged is gone. They can no longer assume you'll be there whenever they decide to reconnect. They can no longer disappear and expect you to remain exactly where they left you. They can no longer take comfort in knowing that regardless of how distant they become, you'll eventually reach out and restore the connection. And that is when they begin to feel the difference between having someone and having access to someone. Think about what happens when something has always been available to you. You may appreciate it, but because it is consistently there, your mind doesn't always register its full importance. The moment it disappears, your awareness changes. The empty chair suddenly becomes noticeable. The quiet room suddenly feels different. The unanswered message suddenly carries weight. The person who used to be one call away is no longer one call away. That doesn't automatically mean they are ready to change. It simply means reality has become harder to avoid. They may start remembering the little things, the way you listened, the way you encouraged them, the way you noticed what others overlooked, the way you made space for their emotions, even when they struggled to express them, the way you stayed through moments when leaving would have been easier. And sometimes what they miss isn't just your physical presence. They miss the emotional experience associated with you. They miss being understood. They miss being cared for. They miss knowing someone genuinely wanted the best for them. They miss the comfort of having someone who believed in them. But here's where you must be wise. Someone missing what you provided does not necessarily mean they have developed the ability to provide what you needed. That's an important distinction. A person can miss your warmth while still being afraid of intimacy. They can miss your attention while still struggling with consistency. They can regret losing you while still lacking the emotional maturity required to build something healthy. So don't confuse someone's discomfort with your absence for evidence of transformation. Real transformation is demonstrated through behavior. When someone truly grows, you don't have to convince yourself that they're different. You see it in their actions. You see accountability. You see consistency. You see communication. You see willingness to have uncomfortable conversations instead of escaping them. And this is why your responsibility isn't to create a powerful absence so that someone will chase you. Your responsibility is to create a powerful presence in your own life. Become present for yourself. Keep the promises you make to yourself. Protect your peace. Honor your boundaries. Build your purpose. Strengthen your character. When you stop organizing your life around whether someone else is coming closer or moving away, you reclaim an enormous amount of emotional energy. And something extraordinary can happen. You begin to realize that you were never responsible for managing another person's fear. You were never required to chase someone into emotional availability. You were never supposed to convince someone that loving you was worth the vulnerability. Love can invite. Love can encourage. Love can be patient. But love cannot force another person to become ready. There is divine wisdom in allowing people to experience the consequences of their choices. Sometimes the lesson someone needs cannot be explained to them. It must be experienced. If someone continually chooses distance, eventually they must experience the distance. If someone continually takes your presence for granted, eventually they must experience your absence. And you don't have to orchestrate that lesson. Life can teach it naturally. Your job is simply to stop interrupting the lesson by repeatedly returning to the same pattern. This is where your power comes back. You stop trying to control whether they miss you. You stop checking whether they noticed your absence. You stop wondering whether they're thinking about you. You stop searching for signs. Instead, you turn your attention toward the life waiting for you. Because the moment you stop needing someone to recognize your value is the moment their recognition loses its power over you. Maybe one day they will look back and understand exactly what they lost. Maybe they will realize that the person they assumed would always be available finally chose themselves. But by then, your greatest achievement may not be that they finally understood your value. It may be that you finally understood it yourself. There is a moment when the entire dynamic between two people changes, and it often happens quietly. No dramatic announcement, no final speech, no attempt to make the other person jealous. You simply stop chasing what keeps moving away from you. And that decision can transform everything. When you have spent a long time pursuing someone emotionally unavailable, your attention becomes focused on their behavior. You wonder why they haven't responded. You analyze their messages. You question whether they still care. You replay conversations and search for the exact moment when everything changed. Your emotional energy becomes organized around another person's distance. But the moment you stop chasing, something remarkable happens. You take that energy back. You stop asking, what can I do to make them stay? You start asking, what do I need to do to become whole? That is the shift from pursuit to purpose. And purpose is powerful because it gives you something that emotional chasing never could. Direction. When you stop explaining yourself repeatedly, you create space for reality to speak. When you stop initiating every conversation, you discover whether the other person is willing to initiate. When you stop repairing every rupture alone, you discover whether they are capable of taking responsibility. You don't have to manufacture a test. You simply stop doing the work that was never supposed to belong entirely to you. This is where many people misunderstand detachment. They think detachment means becoming cold. It doesn't. Detachment means loving without losing yourself. It means caring without controlling. It means being compassionate without becoming responsible for another person's emotional state. It means saying, I care about you, but I cannot carry this relationship by myself. That boundary changes the dynamic because it removes the possibility of unlimited access without accountability. If someone knows you'll always chase, they never have to confront what their withdrawal is creating. But when you step back, they encounter the natural consequence of their behavior. They have to decide whether they genuinely want connection or simply enjoyed knowing you were available. And that distinction matters because someone can enjoy your attention without being prepared to build a relationship. Someone can enjoy your affection without being ready to offer emotional security. Someone can miss you without knowing how to love you consistently. Your responsibility is not to solve that contradiction for them. Your responsibility is to observe it, watch what they do, listen to what they say. Notice whether their actions and words align, because words can create hope, but patterns reveal truth. When you stop chasing, you also stop giving away your power to someone else's mood. If they're warm today, you don't feel valuable. If they're distant tomorrow, you don't feel worthless. Your identity becomes anchored somewhere deeper. And this is where divine principles become important. You were created with purpose, not merely to be accepted by another person. Your life has meaning beyond one relationship. Your gifts have value beyond someone's approval. Your future cannot be reduced to whether one person chooses you. Sometimes the door you desperately want opened is the very door that keeps you standing in the wrong room. And when you finally walk away from that door, you may discover that your life was waiting for you on the other side. You begin investing in your health, your work, your friendships, your family, your spiritual life, your dreams, and your personal growth. You begin becoming someone you are proud to be, not to make the other person regret losing you, not to make them watch you succeed, not to post a better life so they will notice. You do it because your life deserves your attention. And ironically, this is often what changes the dynamic most profoundly. When you no longer need their attention no longer controls your emotional state. When you no longer need them to validate you, their validation loses its power. When you no longer chase their affection, you can finally see the relationship clearly. You can ask the questions that matter. Is there mutual effort? Is there emotional safety? Is there respect? Is there consistency? Can we communicate when things become difficult? Can both of us take responsibility? Those questions are more powerful than do they miss me? Because missing someone is easy. Building something healthy is difficult. And if they return, you don't need to run toward them simply because they finally opened the door. You can pause, you can observe, you can require consistency. You can allow their actions to speak. The person who once chased answers can become the person who calmly waits for evidence. That is growth. You don't become powerful because someone finally comes back. You become powerful because you no longer abandon yourself if they don't. And from that place, every decision becomes clearer. You can welcome someone who demonstrates genuine growth. You can release someone who continues repeating the same pattern. Either way, you are no longer negotiating against yourself. You have changed the dynamic because you have changed your position within it. You are no longer standing outside yourself, waiting for someone else to choose you. You are standing within yourself, choosing the life you were meant to live. One of the most important things you can understand when dealing with an avoidant person is this. Regret is not the same as transformation. Someone can realize they lost you and still not be ready to love you in the way you deserve. Someone can miss you and still repeat the same behavior. Someone can feel the pain of your absence and still lack the courage to confront the fears that caused the distance in the first place. This distinction can save you from returning to the same cycle, because when someone finally feels your absence, you may receive the message you were hoping for. They may say they miss you. They may tell you that they have been thinking about you. They may suddenly become affectionate. They may remember the beautiful moments and speak about how much you meant to them. And your heart may immediately want to believe that everything has changed. But slow down. Emotion is not transformation. A temporary feeling can be powerful, but a healthy relationship requires consistent behavior. Think about it this way. If someone regrets breaking something, regret may make them wish they hadn't done it. But wishing the damage hadn't happened doesn't automatically give them the skills to repair what was broken. The same principle applies to relationships. Someone can regret pushing you away without understanding why they push people away. They can regret losing you without learning how to communicate. They can regret their behavior without developing emotional responsibility. They can fear losing you again without becoming capable of creating emotional safety. That is why you must learn to look beyond words. Look for patterns. Has their communication become more consistent? Do they acknowledge their role without blaming circumstances? Are they willing to have difficult conversations? Do they respect your boundaries even when those boundaries inconvenience them? Do they follow through on what they promise? Do they demonstrate patience when rebuilding trust? Do their actions remain consistent after the emotional intensity disappears? These questions matter because transformation is not something a person announces. It is something they demonstrate. Anybody can say, "I've changed." Real change says, "Watch what I consistently do." And this is where wisdom becomes essential. You don't have to punish someone for their past. You don't have to hold resentment. You don't have to assume that people can never grow. People can change. People can heal. People can become more emotionally available, but you don't have to gamble your peace on the possibility that someone might change. You can give people room to demonstrate who they are. That is different from giving unlimited access. You can say, "I hope you grow, but I will not sacrifice myself while waiting for that growth." That is love with boundaries, and boundaries are not walls designed to keep everyone out. Healthy boundaries are doors with standards. They say, "You are welcome here, but not at the cost of my dignity." They say, "I can forgive you, But forgiveness doesn't erase the need for changed behavior. They say, I can understand why you struggled, but understanding your struggle doesn't require me to continue experiencing its consequences. That is maturity. Sometimes people confuse compassion with self-abandonment. They think being understanding means tolerating everything. It doesn't. You can understand someone's wounds and still recognize that their wounds are hurting you. You can have empathy for someone's fear of intimacy and still decide that you need consistency. You can care about someone's healing and still refuse to become their emotional rehabilitation center. Their healing is their responsibility. Your healing is yours. And perhaps the most important thing is this. Don't let someone's sudden regret reopen a door that their consistent behavior has not earned. If they return, don't listen only to what they say in the emotional moment. Watch what happens afterward. Anyone can return when loneliness becomes uncomfortable. Anyone can reach out when nostalgia becomes powerful. Anyone can promise change when they fear losing access, but transformation reveals itself over time. It survives ordinary days. It survives disagreement. It survives discomfort. It survives moments when there is nothing to gain. That is when you know whether the person has truly changed. So don't be hypnotized by the intensity of their return. Look for the stability of their behavior. The person who genuinely wants to rebuild will understand that trust may take time. They won't demand immediate access to the old version of you. They won't pressure you to forget. They won't become angry because you have boundaries. They will understand that rebuilding something valuable requires patience. And if they are unwilling to do that, then their regret may simply be about losing access to you, not about becoming capable of loving you differently. You don't need to judge them. You don't need to chase them. You don't need to prove anything. Simply observe. Let time reveal what emotion tries to hide, because anyone can feel regret. But transformation requires courage. It requires humility. It requires accountability. It requires discipline. And above all, it requires consistent action when nobody is watching. There is a moment in your healing when the question changes. At first, you may be consumed by one thought: will they come back? You wonder whether they miss you, whether they regret what happened, whether they finally understand your value, and whether one day they will realize that losing you was a mistake. But eventually, something deeper happens. You stop making their realization the measure of your healing. You begin to understand that your greatest victory isn't getting someone to choose you. Your greatest victory is refusing to abandon yourself just because someone else didn't. That is a completely different kind of strength. For a long time, you may have believed that being chosen by the person you love would finally prove that you were enough. If they came back, you would feel valuable. If they apologized, you would feel validated. If they finally committed, you would feel like all the waiting and suffering had meaning. But your worth cannot be placed in another person's hands. If someone chooses you, that doesn't create your value. If someone leaves you, that doesn't destroy your value. Your value existed before the relationship, during the relationship, and after the relationship. And when you truly understand that, you stop negotiating with people over your dignity. You stop asking someone to give you the bare minimum and calling it love. You stop explaining why consistency matters. You stop trying to convince someone that your heart deserves care. You stop chasing someone who keeps making you question where you stand. You begin choosing yourself. Choosing yourself does not mean becoming selfish. It means becoming responsible for your own life. It means recognizing that nobody else can build your inner foundation for you. Nobody else can give you permanent peace. Nobody else can complete the purpose that was placed inside you. A relationship can add beauty to your life, but it should never become the foundation upon which your entire identity rests. There is divine wisdom in learning to stand alone without becoming lonely. You discover that solitude can become a classroom. In solitude, you hear your own thoughts again. You rediscover the dreams you postponed. You recognize the standards you compromised. You notice how often you ignored your intuition because you were afraid of losing someone. And then you begin rebuilding, not for revenge, not so they will see what they lost, not so they will regret leaving. You rebuild because you finally understand that your life is too valuable to remain paused while waiting for someone else to make a decision. You begin putting energy into your purpose. You strengthen your character. You become more disciplined. You improve your relationships with people who genuinely care about you. You develop your gifts. You deepen your faith. You take better care of your mind and your body. You become intentional about who receives access to your energy. And slowly, something beautiful happens. The person you were desperately trying to convince someone else to love becomes someone you deeply respect yourself. That's transformation. You no longer need to become better so someone will regret losing you. You become better because growth is part of your calling. You don't become successful to prove them wrong. You become successful because you were never meant to live beneath your potential. You don't become emotionally strong so they will chase you. You become emotionally strong because life will require strength from you in places that have nothing to do with that relationship. And when you reach that level of inner stability, the question, will they come back, begins to lose its power. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But now you understand something important. Their decision does not determine your direction. If they return with genuine change, you can evaluate their actions with wisdom rather than desperation. If they return with the same patterns, you can walk away without destroying yourself. If they never return, you can still move forward. That is freedom. Because your future is no longer dependent upon someone else's emotional availability. You can love someone and still release them. You can forgive someone and still maintain distance. You can remember someone with gratitude and still refuse to repeat the pattern. You can appreciate what the relationship taught you without allowing the relationship to define you. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson of all. Sometimes the person you were trying so desperately not to lose was never supposed to be more important than the person you were becoming. You were becoming stronger. You were becoming wiser. You were becoming more discerning. You were learning that love without self-respect becomes self-abandonment. You were learning that boundaries do not make you difficult. You were learning that peace is not something you should have to beg for. And you were learning that being alone is not the same as being abandoned. When you choose yourself, you don't close your heart. You refine your standards. You don't stop loving. You stop chasing. You don't become bitter. You become wiser. You don't stop believing in relationships. You stop believing that suffering is the price of love. And from that place, you become capable of building relationships based on mutual respect, emotional safety, honesty, consistency, and genuine choice. Because now you aren't looking for someone to rescue you from loneliness. You're looking for someone who can walk beside the person you have already become. And that changes everything. So remember, the moment someone realizes they lost you is not necessarily the moment your story changes. The real turning point is the moment you realize you are no longer willing to lose yourself for anyone. Let your silence be peace, your boundaries be strength, and your growth be the proof that you chose yourself. Whether they return or not, keep moving toward the person you were created to become. Thank you for listening. Thank you for giving yourself permission to grow. And may you walk forward with courage, wisdom, faith, and peace. Take care of yourself. Keep believing in your purpose. And until we meet again, goodbye.